Well, we started out singing about the silent night. Let's talk about the worst night ever, the night that Jesus was betrayed. By the way, we're going to skip out of Luke when it comes to Christmas time and do a Christmas message this year. We didn't do that last year. Pardon me? How much closer? How's that? Imagine you were there that night, and Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he says, "One of you will betray me." And they say, "Which one?" And he reaches over and he points Judas out, and then he says to Judas, "What you do quickly." And Judas gets up and goes out from the meal. What do you think the next conversation was besides which one would be greatest? Because the scripture says they started talking about which one would be greatest. But don't you think that there must have been some discussion about where Judas went? And, maybe he was doing this or maybe he was doing that. But they were told clearly that one would betray him. And so that was somebody that was their friend, somebody that had been working in ministry with them for at least 3 years, somebody that they respected. They let him handle the money. And all of a sudden he goes out and betrays Jesus. And they start talking amongst themselves about which one would be the greatest. And Jesus said to them, "The shepherd will be stricken and the sheep will be scattered." And then Peter stands up and said, "Not me. Not me." This was probably the worst night ever. Let me get my slideshow running here. "Simon, Simon, listen." Now, in the Bible, they have, and the way they talked in those days, they talked with the emphatic. You know what emphatic means? With emphasis. And how they emphasized things were to say it twice. So Jesus would say, "Truly, truly, I say to you," which means you really better listen because this is just no ordinary truth. This is a very important truth that you should listen to. And another time he said, "Let your yes be yes. Let your no be no." I think this is too loud, isn't it? It's not? Okay. Sounds too loud to me, and I can't hear a darn thing. "Simon, Simon, listen." Notice in the King James Version, which is the second paragraph there, the translation is, "The Lord said, Simon, Simon." In the New Revised Standard, which is the one that we're using, it doesn't say, "And the Lord said." And in the Young's Literal Translation, it says, "And the Lord said, Simon, Simon." Now, ordinarily, Simon is Peter, and ordinarily when Jesus spoke about Peter, he called him Peter and not Simon. And whenever it mentions this guy, when Jesus first called him and his brother Andrew into the ministry, it says, "Simon, who the Lord called Peter." Simon is an ordinary name. It's like one of the 12 tribes of Israel, Simeon. So a lot of people named their kid Simon. It's the Greek version of the name, and it basically means listen. But Jesus always called him, not always, because not in this case. Jesus usually called him Peter, which means the knucklehead, the rock, the unmovable person who you can't argue with. He always called him that. Not always, not this time. But this time he refers to him by his birth name. He doesn't call him the rock, even though Peter is saying, "I will never betray you. I will be with you to the end." And Jesus doesn't call him Peter at that point. He calls him Simon. He says, "Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat." Now notice also In the King James Version, which is the second paragraph there, it says, Satan hath desired to have you. And in the Young's literal translation, it says, the Lord said, the adversary did ask you for himself. Now, I was reading, I read old scholars. Most of the people that I read about Bible interpretation are people that lived in the 17 and 1800s. And you know what they all said when I was reading this? The you is plural. Now, we have, we can't tell in English if you is singular unless, I would say, you guys, you all. But in the Greek language, there is a singular you and a plural you. And this is a plural you. And so Jesus, when he's saying that Peter would deny, he's saying also that the others would as well. And the newest translation actually captures this when it says, all of you. Satan. Well, what is Satan? Well, Satan is the principal character responsible for adversity in the world and in our lives. All adversity is said to be satanic in the Bible. It's not just a horned red guy with a pitchfork. I don't know where that came from, but that's not how Satan is depicted in the Scriptures. God can actually be Satan to people if God comes against people because of what they've done. He is an adversary, and therefore he is a Satan, because that's what the word is used. It's a descriptive word. And so what he's saying is that the devil or Satan or adversity desires to conquer you. How many of you have had adversity in your life? It's satanic, especially when it comes to our Christian life. Adversity will prove what is what. You come up and spit in my face, you'll see the real me. I promise you that. And it won't be pretty. People steal stuff. I'm really upset. I had a beautiful concretion that I stole from the ravine. And I put it out in front of my house. Somebody stole it from me. I don't think can you really steal a rock out of the ravine? Probably not, but it did belong to whoever. I think it belonged to Fred, actually. It was part that he used to own that he sold to Oksana Fuller. But it was a beautiful concretion. Somebody stole it, and I felt that was not right, that they should steal my concretion. And I was not happy about it. And I complained about it on my Facebook. I've had some real adversity, as you probably have. If you're young and you haven't faced adversity yet, you will. Things will happen. People that you love will do you wrong. People will be disrespectful. Simon, listen. See, there's the emphatic. Satan has demanded to sift you all like wheat. Well, what does that mean? It has a very specific meaning. It is a metaphor that they understood better than we understand, so let's take a look at that. Oops, what happened? What is the next slide there? Okay. Wheat and chaff. Did you ever pick wheat in the field and take the little grains out of it and chew it down? You shouldn't do that because there's gluten in it. That was before you realized how bad gluten is for you. You can't eat the wheat with the protective coating on it. The protective coating is called chaff. And it's an important thing for the wheat because it keeps the water off of it and it keeps the bugs out of it. But when you want to have some wheat, then you have to somehow get the chaff off of the wheat. And so Jesus says to Simon Peter, adversity wants to sift you like wheat. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. It's thinking, is threshing and thrashing the same thing? It is. What they would do is they would take the wheat, they would bundle it up like we have in this picture over here, and they would bring it to a threshing floor. And they have to get rid of all the stems, and they have to get rid of all the chaff which is around the wheat heads. And so what they would do is they would put an animal in the center of the threshing floor, and they would force the animal to walk around it all day long, maybe a carrot hanging in front of its mouth or something, and the animal would squish the seeds until the chaff comes off of it. And the word that I always heard as a kid was thrashing. He got a good thrashing from his father, so I looked up to see if it was the same word, and it actually is. Somebody does something wrong and they get punished for it. That's the etymology or the origin of the word. So the first thing, in order to sift wheat, is it has to be crushed. It has to be trodden upon. Did anyone ever trodden upon you? Did God ever trodden upon you? Sometimes I'd rather be trodden upon by people than God. I don't know about you. So in order for wheat to be sifted, it has to be thrashed first. Then they would put it in the winnowing barn. There isn't a picture of a winnowing barn here, but what they would do is they would build a building that was open on both ends to the prevailing wind. So if they were going to build a winnowing barn here, the opening end would be on this end and on this end, and when the winds come through, or maybe it would be a little bit northeast if it was wintertime, and they would take a winnowing fork, which is what this gentleman has in his hand, and they would throw the wheat and the chaff up in the air, and the chaff would blow through the winnowing barn, and only the grain would fall to the bottom of the floor. So that's step number 2. And here's an example of a modern threshing machine. You can see, next slide please, you can see here the John Deere tractor, and it goes through, it grabs all the wheat and the chaff, and there's a big fan in there, and it blows the chaff out the back, as you can see it. So it's a much easier way to do it here in the 21st century than the way they had to do it in the past. But in the end, the result is the same. That outer protection, that outer coating is removed, and it makes the grain usable. So when Jesus says, Peter, all of you, the disciples as well, Satan's desired to be an adversary to you, but I've prayed for you. That's the good news. Next slide, please. I've prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. You know, I've talked to a lot of people over the years, and they explain to me why they don't believe in God. Well, I used to believe in God, one man told me, and then I went into the Navy and I was in Vietnam, and I saw my buddies get killed, and now I don't believe in God. Or they say things like, well, I was supposed to inherit some money from my mother, but I was... What's the proper Christian word for screwed? I'm trying to think of a word. Taken advantage of by a member of my family. And how could God allow that to happen to me? Or how could God allow something to happen to somebody else? And they come to the place where they lose faith. And Jesus recognized, because of what was about to happen, they did not realize fully what was about to happen, even though he had told them, we're going to Jerusalem, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed, given to the priests, and then given to the Romans, and he's going to die. And we've talked about this over the last year as they're making their journey to Jerusalem. So they've been told, but they didn't quite get it. So at this point, they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest, and Peter says, I will never deny you. You know, there are a lot of ways you can deny Jesus without saying, I don't believe in Jesus. You can deny him by your behavior. Have any of you denied Jesus by your behavior? I know I have with 2 hands. Especially when I was a younger Christian, because I didn't really become a Christian until I was 21 years old. So I had a long time between age 12 when I started taking drugs and when I was 21 years old. I did a lot of things that weren't too good. The drinking age was 18 in those days. And I did a lot of things that were not good. And then when I became a Christian, I still did things that I shouldn't have been doing because I hadn't gotten cleaned up yet. The purpose of being a Christian is to get yourself cleaned up, and that takes faith, and that takes longevity, and it takes the working of the Holy Spirit. And so Jesus says, I've prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. And once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Well, in order to turn back, you have to turn away. And that's what repentance is. It's a military term, which means simply about face. You're going this way, and you do an about face, and you go the other way. You're serving the devil, you're going this way, and God says, no, you need to go this way. And so he says to Peter, who thinks that he's not going to betray Jesus, after you go through this humiliation, after you see who you really are, I'm praying that your faith won't fail, and at that point, your job is to help other people with failed faith, because all of the disciples had failed faith that night. They could not see the resurrection. They could not see anything except the betrayal, and they're all thinking that they're going to be crucified. They're thinking that they're going to go to jail. They're thinking that it's going to be really bad. And yes, it is really bad what's about to happen, and yet afterwards they changed the world. And they did it with some spiritual exercise. Now, a few years ago, I went to the Y. Gene keeps telling me, hey, you ought to go to the Y. I go to the Y, I do this, and I run. What do you do? Do you do the elliptical there?
I do what they call a circuit. It's an electronic exercise.
So you're physically fit. Not me, man.
Better than I was as far as strength. No better than I was as far as weight loss.
I used to go to the Y, and for about a year, I did the elliptical, and I would do 5 miles. And I remember there was a day, it was in the summer, and I was parked in Wegmans parking lot, and it was raining, and I ran into Wegmans, and I got there, and I was feeling good. Now, if I have to run to the back door, forget it, because I haven't done my exercise. And there are spiritual exercises that are necessary for strength. What are some of them? Reading the Bible. Prayer. Fellowship. Church attendance. Meditation. Meditation, I think, is one of the most important. People say to me, how do you get all this stuff out of the scripture? Simple. I sit down and I look at it and I think about what could relate to it. What did you say? Tithing? Yeah, that's a spiritual discipline. What was Jesus saying about sifting? How did they sift? How did it work? What did it do? You think that the things around it. What would I have thought if I was in that place? Meditation is important to understand the scripture. And so if you strengthen your faith with spiritual disciplines. Church attendance, being with other people, saying your prayers, observing where you are and how you might say something to somebody who you happen to run into. I don't want to go too far on that one. And Peter said, next slide please, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and death. Well, I used to go to Auburn Prison years ago. Between 1979 and 1988, I went almost every week to Auburn Prison. And church work is easy compared to those guys. Most of them are type 1 personalities who have no respect for anybody but themselves. Most of them. That's why they're there. With the exception of the child molesters. They're tough people. They're from Bedford-Stuyvesant. I mean, they're from neighborhoods that you wouldn't even want to walk through. Peter says, I'm willing to go to prison with you. Well, there was one guy, I don't know if you remember this. Do you remember you're too young, the last great invasion of immigrants? You remember when that was? It was in the 1970s. It was called the Mariel Boat Lift. Do you remember that? Fidel Castro said, how can I get rid of these prisoners? I know, I'll let them go to America. And he brought some boats in, and he emptied all the prisoners from Cuba and put them on boats and sent them to Florida. And when they got there, there was a big outcry. You know, how could you send us all the prisoners? Well, a similar thing is happening today. In that case, it was all Cuban prisoners. And one of the men, there were a lot of men in the prison when I was going that were among the Mariel Boat Lift. And one guy said to me one night, I've been in prison in the Dominican Republic, and I've been in prison in Cuba. He said, this is the Holiday Inn. What do you think prison was like in the first century when Romans were in charge of these rebellious Jews? I'm willing to go with you wherever, Jesus. I'm pretty proud of myself. Let's think about yourself. Are you pretty proud of yourself? I know I am. I'm with Jesus to the end. How about you? I don't smoke or take drugs. How about you? Or chew. In the South, they used to say, I don't smoke, chew, or chew. I don't drink, smoke, or chew. How about you? As if that was the standard of spirituality. That's the way Peter was. He was the number one knucklehead. But you know what? He could preach on Pentecost and 3,000 people give their life to Jesus after he came through this. This made him who he was, actually, what was about to happen to him. So here's Auburn Prison. I don't know. You've never been in there, have you? You have? Where were you? Just the lobby? Okay, well, when you come in the front door, there's this great big front door with a great big huge key on it. Do you remember seeing that? And when you came into the lobby, then there was a metal detector. That's where people get to see. And then you go through the one door. There's a door that slides open, and if you put your arm in, it'll cut your arm off. And then there's like a little area like this. You go through the first door, they shut that door, and then the second door opens after the first door closes. And you go through the second door, and you go up a set of stairs and around, and you get to another door, and there's a guy behind a bulletproof glass, and he sees that you're the right person to come in, and he cranks the door open. And you go into another little holding room. Then they close that door. And then when that door is closed, then they open the other door, and you go into a hall, and you go to your left, and then there's another gate, which another person in behind the wall in that little room opens that door, and after you go through, you go down a set of stairs, and there's another person that will open the door into the yard. How many is that? Let's just say nobody has ever escaped from Stalag 13. Nobody's ever escaped from Auburn. And Auburn is, I don't know if this is still there, but this old Sparky, they used to electrocute people in the electric chair there in Auburn. And I think it's still in the prison, although it might be in the museum in Auburn. I'm not sure if it's, we'll have to ask your mother when she's around sometime. Yeah, because he works in there. Yeah, ask him and let me know, because I'd be interested if it's still in the prison. I'm ready to go with you to prison. Prison is not a fun place. We used to go in with the Syracuse University on Friday night. And so there was all these teachers that we went in. We went across the yard, and there were more gates to get through across the yard into the school. And as we would walk in, all the men that were locked in the one side of the prison would whistle and catcall and scream, because there would be some females with us. And I didn't mind that too much until one night we went in there without any women, and the exact same thing happened. Gave me a realization of what's really going on in there. I'm willing to go to prison for you, Jesus. If you go, I'm willing to go. If they kill you, I'll be willing to die. And Jesus said, in essence, you are not ready. Mark tells us they all left him and fled. Now, I'm going to jump ahead in the story here because I want to get to Peter's denial, but there's a lot of things happen between this and what happens to Peter later in the night, but I'm going to cover it all today, and then I'll skip it when we get to it sometime after the first of the year. I tell you, Peter, now look, he's not Simon anymore. He's the knucklehead, the rock guy. The cock will not crow this day until you denied 3 times that you know me. Now, if you travel around the world, everybody has chickens, and most of them have a rooster. One day, in Canandaigua, you're only allowed to have, I think, 6 or 7. How many are you allowed, Jim? Chickens? 7. And you're not allowed to have a rooster because the rooster is noisy. And as soon as the sun comes up, or sometimes even before the sun comes up, they'll start crowing. And I was, the neighbor over here across the street who have moved on with their roosters to another place, they had one, and I was standing on the front porch before church one day, and the rooster was over there crowing, and somebody said to me, "What is that noise?" They never heard a rooster. They grew up in a village or in a city or something. I said, "That's a rooster." Oh. Well, let me show you. This is not a literal rooster. In Mark, it tells us, when talking about the coming of the Lord, which we discussed, a month ago, here in Luke, therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn. Okay, for those of you who are over the age of 40, that's 3 o'clock on the face of the dial. And those of you who are younger, it's 3 o'clock digitally. Evening is 9 p.m. Midnight is midnight. 3 a.m. is cock crowing, and 6 a.m. is morning. So we see that this whole thing that happens, the rest of Jesus, is done under the cover of darkness. They said, not during the festival, because there might be a riot, and then Judas comes and says, I'll do it for 30 pieces of silver, and then they change their mind, and that allows Jesus to be crucified during the Passover, according to the prophecies that were coming. So the fact that Judas did it at that particular time and at that particular night made it so that it happened exactly according to prophecy. And so what Jesus is saying is, before 3 this morning, you'll deny me 3 times. Now, how did they time in those days? I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was no standard set time until the railroads were put through in the 1840s. It might be 3:05 in Cheshire, and it might be 3:30 in Canandaigua. Because I don't know about you, I've got these old clocks that I have to wind them up, and one of them moves fast, and one of them moves slow, and the third one is stopped. It's stuck at 2. It's an old Three Stooges joke, if you've ever seen that. He has 3 wristwatches. So when I set my clock, I set it this morning, and I looked at my digital. Oh, I'm almost out of time here. Oh, don't worry. You'll get out before lunch. There was no standard time, but the railroads had to run on time, and so they had what was called a regulator. They had a regulator clock that kept good time, and so all the railroads would synchronize their time using the telegraph, and so you could be sure that your train would appear at a certain time and drop you off at a certain time. But in the old days, they had not an hourglass, but a 3-hour-glass. And so they would, when it would be evening, they would tip the thing upside down. How does it work? There's sand, and it goes through a little teeny hole, and it takes exactly 3 hours to get to the bottom. And then they turn it over. So when it runs out, they turn it over to midnight, and when it runs out, it turns over to 3. And how did they let the time know? They would blow a trumpet. If you've ever been in a place where there's Muslims, first thing the crack of dawn, they broadcast prayer time. And this trumpet comes across, and it means get up and do your whatever Muslims do. How many? They pray like 54 times a day or something like that. And they would do that in biblical times. It's time to get up and go to work, or it's the middle of the night. You know, I have an automatic clock that tells me it's 3 in the morning. I have to get up at 3 every day. So before 3 times before 3, I will follow you to the death, Jesus. I'm the strongest. I'm the greatest of the apostles. No, you're not. So let's go to 3. Then a servant girl, this is Luke 22:56. A servant girl, seeing him in the firelight. You know, in those days, people went to bed when it got dark, and they got up when it got light. And they worked longer in the summer, and they worked less in the winter because there was less light. So they're all there. Jesus has been grabbed by this posse of people, and everybody's fled, but Peter's still there somewhere. And this servant girl, slave girl, says, this man was with him. You know, it's really a good thing if people recognize that you've been with Jesus. I remember one time years ago when I was selling secondhand goods in a store in Canandaigua. I don't know if you knew that I had a secondhand store, but I did. And in one day walked a man and a woman. And I could tell there was godliness all over them. They had been with Jesus, and I knew it. And I said, you guys are Christians, aren't you? Oh, yes, we go to such and such a church. Wouldn't it be great if everybody could recognize us as being a Christian? This woman says, this man, Peter, he was with Jesus. And Peter said, I don't know him. Never met the guy in my life. What's he look like? You know, I don't know this guy. Later, someone else, on seeing him, said, "You're also one of them." Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then about an hour later, still another kept insisting, "Surely this man was also with him. He's a Galilean." How did they know he was a Galilean? By his accent, by his manner of clothing. Here's a Galilean guy, and there was a whole bunch of Galilean guys with him. This is one of his people. Luke kind of lightens up what Peter actually said. "I don't know what you're talking about." And while he was still speaking, the cock crowed. The horn blew. 3 a.m. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord. How he'd said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. Now, some of the versions say the cock crows twice. And the scholars tell us that during the Passover and the other major holidays, they would blow the horn twice at each watch of the night instead of once. And he went out and wept bitterly. He thought he had it together. And just when you think that, you might figure out you don't. Why is the story in here? The story is in here not to talk about negative about Peter, because Peter in the end did wonderful things for God, but he needed to be brought to a place of humility. And he needed to understand that he had denied the Lord, and so had the others. Next slide, please. This is the positive thing about the whole thing. I've prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. So, some people might say, well, I don't believe in God anymore. Well, you can come back to God. Or I really blew it with God and I messed up my whole life. That's okay. You can come back. This is the hope that you can give people. Well, somebody might say, well, if somebody really messes up and then comes back, doesn't that make it like easy grace? If you can come back. And Paul answered that question by saying, in the book of Romans, should we continue to sin that grace might abound, because God's grace is great and he takes people back? The answer to that is, God forbid it. That's not why grace is there. Will he forgive? He 100% will. But should we sin so that he can forgive some more? No, that's not the right way. So, they all fled, and they all were in what probably the darkest day of their life, because they really didn't understand that Jesus wasn't dead permanently, but they did understand that he was dead. So that's really an Easter sermon, but it's Christmas time. So just think Silent Night, Holy Night. Then remember, this was a bad night. So if you want to say yes to God, it's a good time to do it. Does anybody have any addition or comment on this before we go home? Janice?
I just have one comment, that one of the things that I think we forgot to add about being a good Christian, when you're practicing being a good Christian, is forgiveness. And that's one of the hardest ones.
Well, if we're going to be like Jesus, we have to be forgiving, don't we? Good point. Janice?
I was just wondering where the sundial fits into this time element.
The sundial is seen in the book of Isaiah. And so they did do that, but that was 700 BC. I don't know if they used sundials in the New Testament time or not. I think they probably did. Gene?
So just to answer Jan, I think the reason the sundial wasn't mentioned is all the events that were taking place were in darkness. So the other thing, when people tell me that they don't believe in God anymore, I ask them if they have seen too much of Peter Pan, because God's not like Tinker Bell. Just because you don't believe in him doesn't mean he doesn't exist.
Yeah, we're going to do communion.
One thing was striking me was it's very hard for people who were raised in the church and then decide there is no God to come back. It's very hard.
That's true. Over here.
It reminded me when God gave permission for them to be scattered, to be tested, just like he did with Job. Now, Satan came before him, and he was, okay, test him, scatter him.
Gonna bust that chaff off of you. There's
Yep.
good wheat underneath.
Yep.
But you got to get to it.
It wasn't easy for any of them.
And it was a problem for the church for centuries as well, because they were persecuted for about 3 centuries. And they still are in some places. Okay, we're going to take communion today. We're back on schedule. Thank you, Bill. And I'm going to wash my hands. And if Keith and Trina maybe can help me do